Good day, fellow travellers, and welcome back to another episode of Mystique of Melbourne. Now, I know it has been quite a while since the last episode, but these episodes are kind of hard to do. Today, we'll be looking at how did Melbourne as a city, as it appears today, actually come to be. There are a couple of disclaimers. First and foremost, I pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land, past and present, on whose land that Melbourne and other Australian cities and Australia as a whole country exists today. I would also like to mention that when the British settlers first came to Australia, they did not treat Indigenous peoples with the proper respect that they deserve. In fact, they didn't treat them very well at all, and they continue to still not treat them properly. And that is something that we definitely must keep in mind. There are so many issues regarding the way that Indigenous people are treated today, and they should be treated. However, I don't feel like I am personally qualified enough to talk about those topics. So for today's video, I'm just going to be focusing on the general history of what happened and not any specifics, and not be talking about the treatment of Indigenous and Native peoples, because I just don't think that I could talk about it properly. Now, when it comes to the Europeans in Australia, the British weren't actually the first people to come here. The first were the Dutch, especially during the 1600s. In 1606, Dutch explorer William Jan Zoet landed on the western side of Cape York and then proceeded to chart about 300 kilometers of the coastline. And information about his ship, the one that he came to Australia in, the Duifken, can be found on the Duifken 1606 replica website, and you can also see a copy of his map online, and I'll link those down below. I've also visited the replica of his ship, so I'll just link the video up above or maybe down below as well too. The Dutch continued to map parts of the western, northern, and even southern coastlines of the then Terra Australis Incognita, meaning unknown southern land, for the next 150 years or so. However, the most significant European landing on Australian soil happened in 1770, when Captain James Cook landed on the eastern coastline of Australia. He is the first recorded European to have been on the eastern coastline. Fun fact, even though most people, including myself, refer to him as Captain James Cook, he was the captain of the HMB Endeavour, the vessel on which he came to Australia in. However, his actual rank was only lieutenant at the time of the discovery, and he was later promoted to commander upon his return to Britain. Before he could return to the miserable island, he landed in Botany Bay, where in April of 1771, he stuck a big old flag into the ground and declared the land for Britain. And while most people regard this as the first occupation of Australia by the British settlers, Captain James Cook had actually previously planted the Union flag on Australian land on Possession Island in August of the previous year. He then returned to Britain with the good news that now they finally had somewhere to store all of their prisoners, because this was the boom of the Industrial Revolution, and God forbid some poor starving child steal a crumb of bread or a handkerchief to clothe themselves. But realistically, when people flocked towards the cities, crime increased and thus prisoners increased. It took quite a significant gap before the 13th of May 1787, when 11 ships set sail from Portsmouth, England, carrying about 1,400 passengers, including civil officers, military officials, convicts, and eventually free settlers. And this fleet of 11 ships has been given the name the First Fleet. It took the fleet 250 days to finally make landfall in Australia, but when they saw Botany Bay, they didn't find it as hospitable as they expected it to be. So instead, they went up and they landed in Sydney Harbour. On the 26th of January 1788, they stuck another flag into the ground and officially started off the first British settlement in Australia. Now, this date has only recently become to be known as Australia Day, and it is quite problematic because, as you can imagine, this date marks the start of Australia's colonisation and thus the forced removal of Indigenous people. While that is absolutely not right at all, it is important to acknowledge that that is what that date today symbolises, and these are the historic origins of it. The naming of the state in which Sydney was in started a tradition of straight up ripping names of other places. And so obviously they decided, well, this land is new, right? We've only just discovered it. And it's in the south. And it also kind of looks like Wales, so maybe the perfect name for this state is New South Wales. And that's how it came to be. The land above the Bass Strait wasn't exactly unknown to the British because it was a piece of land right there, but for most years there only remained an occasional visit down there. When the establishments in New South Wales really seemed to be flourishing, Governor King cast his eyes south down towards the harbour, which could be a useful trading port and also a potential point of entry onto now British land, Port Phillip Bay. It was towards this very bay that the HMS Calcutta left for in April of 1803. When it landed in Sullivan Bay in October, however, Lieutenant Colonel Collins, commander of the expedition, deemed the land a rather horrid place to start a settlement. I can imagine he was caught saying something like, "The currents here are too strong, the soil too sandy, the timber too poor, the land too swampy, and fresh water so scarce. Why, it's simply unlivable." Not knowing that had he had travelled about 60 kilometres straight up from where he was, he would be standing on the land that now makes up Melbourne, 7 times winner of the most livable city in the world. The party did eventually leave back up to New South Wales, however, I suppose the place left quite an impression on 11-year-old John Pascoe Fawkner. The settlement of Victoria actually started off in present-day Portland. However, when it comes to Melbourne, John Batman was a man who sailed up to the mouth of the Yarra in his Batmobile. Sorry, the Rebecca. That was the name of his little boat in April of 1835. A fellow resident from Van Diemen's Land, present-day Tasmania, also was interested in Batman's discoveries, so he went up to him and was sort of like, "Hey Batman, could you tell me about what the northern shoreline of Port Phillip Bay is like? I just want to know, I promise I won't steal your land." And Batman, trusting this fellow called John Pascoe Fawkner, told him. Upon receiving the information of Batman's discoveries, Fawkner did the only logical thing one can do, assemble a crew and send them off to claim the land for himself. Precisely what he told Batman that he wouldn't do. And he was rather successful in this endeavour because on the 30th of August, 1835, the Enterprise, which was his ship and the crew that he sent over, landed on the northern banks of the Yarra and declared Melbourne as theirs. Batman only learned of the betrayal a few days later, after which he wrote a very sad, heartbroken song called Boating License. Or something like that. In the end, however, both parties agreed that it would be more beneficial for them to work together to build this new settlement than to argue over it and not have a settlement at all. At first, New South Wales made many attempts to stop this new settlement from forming, which then became known as the Port Phillip district in New South Wales. However, when they saw that it was really flourishing and functioned as an almost semi-autonomous colony, they decided that perhaps it was time to send down Captain William Lonsdale to maintain law and order in this new town. It was also at this point in 1837 that they decided, well, if we're sending someone over to go help them, well then we suppose that it should also be given a name. It was named after William Lamb, the second Viscount Melbourne, who was the British Prime Minister of the time. Following on, in September of 1839, Charles Latrobe became the Superintendent of Port Phillip District, and thus a separate police force, a separate customs office, and a separate lands office was established. The colony was finally freed from the clutches of New South Wales on the 1st of July, 1851, when it was granted permission to separate into its own state and was named after the British monarch at the time, Queen Victoria. At the time of the separation, there was about 80,000 settlers in the state, 20,000 of whom were in Melbourne. However, this was a far cry from the number of British settlers that New South Wales housed, 200,000. But Victoria would not remain such an itty-bitty state for long. Now, for an additional segment to this video, which is how exactly was Melbourne named? Because obviously the only way that you can name places is after people, right? Latrobe University is named after Charles Latrobe, and John Pascoe Fawkner got the suburbs of Fawkner and Pascoe Vale, John Fawkner Private Hospital, Fawkner Park, and Fawkner Beacon and Weather Station. And while Faulkner may have got to Melbourne first, it seems that in the long term, Batman got more recognition because these are the list of places named after John Batman. You might have to hang in there for this one. John Batman got the electoral division of Batman before its name was changed, Batman Park in Melbourne CBD and Batman Park in Northcote, Batman Hill and Batman Railway Station, Batman Avenue in Melbourne, Batman Avenue in Keeler Park, Batman Avenue in Sunbury, Batman Avenue in Hurstbridge and Batman Avenue in Shepparton. He also got Batman Road in Eltham and Batman Road in Indented Head. And Batman Street in Burnside Heights, Batman Street in Footscray, Batman Street in Altona Meadows, Batman Street in Aberfeldy, Batman Street in Fitzroy North, and Batman Street in Port Arlington. Then additionally got John Batman Drive and John Batman Gardens. And this is just a list of places named after him in Victoria and Melbourne, but in Victoria, these are all of the places named after him. He also has a couple of places named after him in a couple other states. And then this is how the Melbourne CBD streets were named. Now, I'm not going to be going into the really small streets and laneways because there are hundreds of them and I don't think I could possibly do that. And two, because it's the main streets that matter anyway. Starting from left to right, Spencer Street was named after John Spencer, the 3rd Earl Spencer, and Chancellor of Exchequer under Lord Melbourne. King and William Streets were named after King William IV. Queen and Elizabeth Streets were named after Queen Elizabeth I. Swanston Street was named after Charles Swanston, a British merchant, banker, and Melbourne politician. Russell Street was named after John Russell, who was the British Home Secretary and the leader of the House of Commons under Lord Melbourne. Spring Street was named after Baron Thomas Spring Rice, who was the Chancellor of Exchequer under Lord Melbourne, but it is also possible that it may have been named Spring Street because of the trees that were blossoming there when it was originally discovered. Starting to go from bottom up, Flinders Street was named after explorer Matthew Flinders, Collins Street was named after Governor David Collins, previously mentioned as Lieutenant Colonel Collins, who deemed the place unlivable. Burke Street was named after Sir Richard Burke, Governor of New South Wales. Lonsdale Street was named after William Lonsdale, the one that came to Melbourne to maintain law and order. Latrobe Street was named after Charles Latrobe. Beckett Street was named after Chief Justice William Beckett of 1852 Victoria. Franklin Street was named after Sir John Franklin, Arctic explorer and Governor of Van Diemen's Land. And additionally, Mackenzie Street was named after Alistair Mackenzie, who was a sheriff and then later the Victorian Treasurer. The only street that I really couldn't find any information on was Ferry Street, so I don't know. Could be named after everyone and they might have just chucked a couple of names into a bucket and then pulled out one and named it like that. I have no idea. That concludes today's episode of Mystique of Melbourne. I do hope you'll be here to join us for our next episode, whenever that may come out, but it may be worth subscribing so that you can be there first. Either way, I do hope that you're having a jolly day. I hope you continue to have a fantastic day, and I shall see you next time on the Goldfields.